Today we're going to be looking at bits. There's a lot of confusion because there's so many doggone bits. However, all you really need to know is there's only really two types of bits. There's a direct pressure, like this snaffle. I put it left and right. I'm pulling directly on the horse's mouth. And leverage bits, like the Feed Store Special. It's got a shank. That means it's got a leverage factor to it. We're going to look at this up close in just a second. Okay, this is a direct pressure bit. It's a little snaffle, what would be called a D-ring snaffle, as a broken mouthpiece. If my hand were the horse's lower jaw and tongue, my thumb's the upper mandible. What happens, it sits in the horse's mouth right there. If I pull left, the horse goes left, right, it goes right. Very good for young horses and problem horses that are having some difficulty understanding how to follow the bit. Number one thing you notice, there's no shank, no shank. So it's a direct pressure, no leverage whatsoever. We're going to look at a leverage bit right now. This is a leverage bit. We see the shank there right off the bat. The mouthpiece is slightly different than our snaffle bit, which we looked at earlier. What happens is, as the horse's lower jaw comes in underneath the bit, the chin strap creates pressure across the chin. When the reins are pulled, it pushes the bridle or mouthpiece down into the horse's mouth, and the chin strap comes up and puts leverage across the chin. Not necessarily a bad or evil thing, but if you have a horse that's young or maybe is having some issues, when we put that much pressure across the horse's jaw and across his chin, it can be confusing and almost overwhelming and can actually compound problems. Now that we understand the basic way bits work as far as direct pressure and leverage, we can see how their configurations come together. This is a buckaroo kind of outfit. It's got the McCarty or Macate for you purists. But again, the snaffle bit that we have in there, it's a direct bit. No shank. When I pull left, that's not putting any more pressure on the horse except the mouthpiece. When we look at the English version of it, which we have the little noseband here, when I put that in the horse's mouth, again, it's just going left and right. So it's very simple, very easy for the horse to understand. We look at another bit over here. This, instantly, as soon as you see that shank, you know it's a leverage bit. This is a nice little Jeremiah Watt bit with a correction mouthpiece. Wonderful bit. But for a horse that's young, like a colt, or a horse that's having some issues, this is going to confuse the heck out of them, so we want to avoid that. The English version of that would be a Pelham, and all of a sudden we say, oh, it's got a snaffle mouthpiece, must be a snaffle. Well, for the deep thinkers of you, you would say, oh, I see a shank. Maybe it's not a direct snaffle, and it's like, yes, that is. Because it has a shank, what happens is it's putting pressure on the chin. So in spite of that snaffle mouthpiece, it's still a leverage bit. So it's got the shank, it's going to be a leverage bit. Now's the part of our program where we like to take letters from viewers. Myra Schoonmaker of Ruprecht, Iowa writes, Joel, you've talked a lot about bits and bridles, but what about hackamores? Well, I'm glad you asked, Myra. This is a hackamore made by Nate Wall. It comprised of three pieces, the bosal, the hanger, and the McCarty. How they work is the horse's head or nose goes through here, and this rests on the end of the nose. A lot of people get confused thinking this is like a halter, which would be like a direct pull bit or a snaffle. Unfortunately, that's wrong, because as I pull on the reins here, I'm also putting pressure on the nose here. So what happens is I get a leveraging effect that comes on the horse's nose. Absolutely nothing wrong with it. They're very good. So when we look at the hackamore, it's actually more of a leverage bit than it is a direct pull implement. All right, now a lot of times we deal with expense on bits. This bit is a 1940s Garcia bit. It's about $1,000 bit, just for the bit. This is a little feed store snaffle bit that probably runs about 20 bucks. So there's a wide discrepancy in price. The big issue that we always want to look at is that we're buying quality products. All right, now we talked about the big gap between expensive bits and cheapo bits. 1,000 to 20 bucks is a pretty big gap. This is that little snaffle I showed you earlier. It is a cheap bit. We can see the weld doesn't quite come together, might even broke. It's just kind of a flimsy cheap, and it feels cheap. So that's not really the best bit. Here we have a nice, well-made snaffle bit that's actually a Jeremiah Watt bit. It's really well made. It's balanced. It has a very finished feel to it, and you can just tell the quality. So when it comes to bits and equipment, we always want to go shoot for that good quality equipment, not the most expensive thing in the world, but we want to shoot for quality. All right, we've talked about bits. There are really only two types of bits: a direct pressure and a leverage bit. As soon as it has a shank, it becomes a leverage bit. We haven't talked about mouthpieces, and that's a deep subject that we won't get into right now. I will, however, tell you that anything with a broken mouthpiece is a snaffle. However, if it has no shank, it would be a direct pressure bit. If it has a shank, it's a leverage bit. This snaffle mouthpiece, but it has a shank, which means it's a leverage bit. This bit, no snaffle mouthpiece, but because it's still side to side, it's a direct pressure bit. So as we look at those kind of bits, we can look at them and instantly say, if it has a shank, it's a leverage bit. If it doesn't have a shank, it's a direct pressure bit. I hope that helps your general knowledge and maybe helps you understand bits and how they work a little bit better.